The man Israel had been hunting for more than a year has been killed. Yahya Sinwar's assassination is a milestone. The images and narratives reveal a stark distinction between myth and reality. At a time when its peacemaking abilities are needed the most, the United Nations is under attack as Israel lashes out. And after the cleansing, the plans for annexation, talk about the settling of Gaza is gaining momentum in Israel. Since the 7th of October 2023, Israel's enemy number one in Gaza has been Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. He was the alleged mastermind of the attacks in which 1,200 people were killed and 200 kidnapped. Hamas confirmed Sinwar's death less than 24 hours after Israel made the announcement. Deputy leader Khalil al-Hayya said Sinwar's death would boost Hamas's determination to fight Israel. To discuss the significance of this moment and how so many of the narratives around Israel's war on Gaza converged on the figure of this one man, Tariq Nafi is here with me. Tariq, for much of the past year, there has been so much reporting on where Yahya Sinwar is, who he was with, what he was doing. And a lot of that reporting shaped our understanding. It also served to legitimize Israel's assault on Gaza. So what's the contrast between what we heard and how he was actually killed?
Well, as you said, Meena, for the best part of a year, we've heard from Israeli officials and Israeli news outlets that Sinwar was hiding in tunnels, that he dressed as a woman to avoid detection, that he was surrounded by Israeli captives that he was using as human shields. The Israeli military's message was that they knew where he was, but they didn't want to endanger the captives. Many of these claims were repeated unquestioningly by Western media outlets. And those narratives served a purpose. They told Israeli citizens that the Israeli intelligence services were back in control and that the military was motivated primarily by concern for the Israelis who were in Gaza. And it was used, as you said, as a way to legitimize Israel's war of annihilation, to demoralize Palestinians, to tell them that the reason that tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed is because Hamas leaders were hiding underground beneath civilians in Gaza, leaving them to be sacrificed. The images and video that the Israeli military has released of Sinwar's final moments tell a very different story. Sinwar is in military fatigues. He's on the battleground. He was not embedded with Israeli captives or Palestinian civilians. He was killed in a chance encounter, not as the result of a sophisticated Israeli intelligence operation. And a little while earlier, I spoke with Mouin Rabbani, an astute analyst of the region's politics, and I asked him what those images and video transmit to both Palestinians and Israelis.
The video images of Sinwar's final moments, where he appears to have lost one hand, and the drone enters the building where he's located, and then in kind of a final act of defiance, he throws a stick at the drone. And this, I think, will, for Palestinians, will be an image of defiance, of someone who fought the Israeli occupier to the very last breath. Then there is, of course, the still image of a group of Israeli soldiers lying over Sinwar's lifeless body. And this, like so many deaths during the past year, will be celebrated with abandon. We already have seen images of sweets being handed out in television studios. During the past year, Israel has been gripped by a constant celebration of Palestinian and Arab death. This death will be celebrated with absolute abandon by Israel, not only by Netanyahu and his people and his government, but I think very broadly throughout Israeli society. It's an image of domination. It's an image of supremacy regained, at least as far as Israelis are concerned. But I think for Palestinians, it's an image of continued defiance until the bitter end.
Rabbani spoke there of an image of supremacy regained for the Israelis. How have those images, the news of Sinwar's killing, how has that been reported in Israeli media?
Across the Israeli media, there's been a mood of triumph and jubilation.
סינואר מסיים את חייו מדמם באפר כנבלה סרוחה, או בשפה שאויבינו מבינים, קול קלב, ביג'י יומו. משפט שעושה עוול לידידו הטוב של האדם. איך?
Celebrating the desecration of Palestinian bodies is something we've seen a lot of over the last year on Israeli telegram groups from Israeli soldiers. But the fact that these images ran on Israeli TV, often unblurred, shocked even some Israeli commentators. One Haaretz reporter called it barbaric and animalistic. And elsewhere, we saw a number of channels trying to push a narrative that Sinwar was actually trying to escape Gaza and leave Palestinians to their fate.
מה עושה סינואר? ממש קרוב לגבול עם הרבה כסף ועם מסמכים. אני חושב המסר לעזתים, תקשיבו, נטש אתכם, היה בדרך החוצה, תבינו את המסר, זה נגמר, תניחו את הנשקים ותיכנו.
So that's the narrative in Israeli media, but that is not how Palestinians are seeing it.
No, and it's worth keeping in mind that Palestinians have been subjected to months of propaganda from Israel saying that their leaders had abandoned them. When more than 1 million Palestinians were forced from the north, forcibly displaced and told to go south, there were Israeli soldiers stationed along that route who were tormenting Palestinians over loudspeakers with this kind of messaging. And that tactic of using propaganda and violence to try and turn the population in Gaza against Hamas is a tactic that goes back many, many years. But by publishing these images of Sinwar, resisting until his final moments, the Israelis have, in effect, immortalized him. And that is a sentiment that you see not just among many Palestinians, but elsewhere in the Arab world too.
But in Israel, Sinwar, his background, his thinking, and especially since the October 7th attacks, all of that was the subject of a kind of macabre fascination, right? There was a singular focus on eliminating him, and when Prime Minister Netanyahu made that announcement that he had been assassinated, there was a sense of vindication to it. So where do things go from here?
You're absolutely right that there was a level of morbid myth-making around Sinwar in Israel. He, of course, spent many years in an Israeli prison. He spoke fluent Hebrew. Many Israelis will have heard the stories of how he allegedly tortured Palestinians suspected of collaborating with Israel. And there have always been experts in Israel who have tried to parse his words, understand his motivations. And you've seen a lot of that in the reporting this week, describing him as having wanted, quote, a jihad that has no barriers and no restraints, that he, quote, had a craze for greatness and enormous ambitions that had no limits. The Egyptian journalist Amir Tibon recently wrote how that reflects a cultural misunderstanding whereby Palestinian and Arab leaders are often seen as inscrutable and alien. In other words, so dehumanized that they can't be motivated by the same yearning for freedom that any person has. And we put this to Mouin Rabbani, this focus on Sinwar, on killing him. Does it bring the Israelis any closer, in their words, to dismantling Hamas?
The assassination of these senior leaders and commanders is indisputably a painful blow. But the idea that an entire organization can be eliminated or will collapse or disintegrate because of a series of assassinations, I think is an Israeli illusion. You know, Israel constantly likes to personalize its conflicts. It's a bit like, it's kind of like a mafia tactic. You know, you hit us, we will get you and your family and so on, as we've seen during the past year. But the issue here is that we're dealing with movements that have an agenda, and an agenda of resistance to an illegal occupation, and now also a genocide that has a very broad popular constituency in Palestinian society, whether that translates into support for Hamas specifically or not. And so the idea that somehow it was because of Yahya Sinwar or because of Ismail Haniyeh or in a previous era because of Yasser Arafat that Palestinians were opposing Israeli rule, and that by removing these leaders that somehow Palestinians would be pacified and be content with their fate under Israeli rule. Again, we have decades of experience that clearly demonstrate that this is not the case, and that this is not going to be the case. So I don't think that Hamas, as a increasingly decentralized organization, will lose either the will or the ability to fight. And more importantly, if Hamas is indeed destroyed by this campaign, it will simply be replaced by something else carrying the exact same agenda of opposition to Israeli rule and Palestinian freedom.
So in other words, this is not the end of the story like so many would like to believe. Thank you, Tariq. Born in the aftermath of an era-defining event, World War II, the United Nations is currently facing challenges like never before. Israel, the country whose existence was formalized by an act of the UN, has emerged as one of the organization's deadliest critics. Throughout the war in Gaza and now Lebanon as well, Israel has pilloried the UN for every statement, every vote, and every resolution. But the battle is beyond just rhetorical. UN workers and facilities have been physically targeted. This past week, UN peacekeepers on the border between Israel and Lebanon faced sustained bombardment from Israeli forces. The justification was that they had been co-opted by Hezbollah, just like Israel has been arguing that workers for UNRWA, the UN's agency dealing with Palestinian refugees, has been infiltrated by Hamas. With Israel on a rampage against the UN and anyone who speaks up in its support, a question becoming more and more urgent is whether this one-of-a-kind international institution, imperfect but vital, can withstand everything being thrown at it.
I don't think that at any point in its history that the United Nations has had a more adversarial relationship with Israel.
The United Nations said its peacekeeping forces in southern Lebanon came under attack today by Israeli forces.
Israel is on the attack when it comes to the United Nations. This is probably the most contentious relationship point Israel has ever had with the UN.
You are shredding the UN Charter with your own hands.
The division of the land of Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel were foundational issues for the United Nations. Resolution 181, passed in November 1947, proposed the carving out of two states, one Jewish and one Arab. What happened in the aftermath, Arab resistance, expulsion, and the Israeli occupation, sealed one of the most bloody and intractable geopolitical issues into the very core of UN operations ever since. Israel and Palestine have been at the heart of innumerable debates in the General Assembly and the Security Council. The issue has prompted the creation of specific commissions and agencies. And as decades have passed and multiple wars have been fought, Israel has developed a deep distrust and dislike for the very institution that mandated its being.
We have a situation where the head of government, Benjamin Netanyahu, gave a speech to the United Nations.
Until this anti-Semitic swamp is drained, the UN will be viewed by fair-minded people everywhere as nothing more than a contemptuous farce.
I can't think of any occasion in the 77 years or so of the United Nations where a head of state or head of government has insulted the United Nations with words like that.
Israel has launched a campaign to discredit every agency, from the Secretary General, the Office of the Secretary General, down to the UN agency UNRWA, working most closely with Palestinian refugees in Gaza.
UNRWA is totally infiltrated with Hamas. It has been in the service of Hamas.
This fed the vitriol and narrative that everybody is against us, especially the UN and its agencies.
Within Israel, the narrative about the United Nations has grown more shrill and contemptuous as the war in Gaza has dragged out and expanded across the region. There have been 2 votes held in the General Assembly on ceasefire resolutions. In both of them, the majority of the votes favored a halt to the war, and yet the bombardment of Gaza continued. The Security Council has voted 4 times, and each time, except once, the United States used its veto and enabled the war to go on. there were the hearings in the genocide case that South Africa brought before the UN's International Court of Justice. Far from abiding by any of the conditions placed on it by the ICJ, Israel has fired accusations at UN agencies like UNRWA, the body tasked with handling the vast issue of Palestinian refugees, and UNIFIL, the peacekeeping force on the border between Lebanon and Israel.
במקרה שלנו הם מקשים עלינו, וחיזבאללה משתמש בהם. הם תופסים מחסות ליד הבסיסים שלהם, יש מנהרות מתחת לבסיסים שלהם.
Well, many Israelis will tell you that there is actually another discreditation campaign by the same UN agencies and organizations against Israel. And I would really describe it as more of an ongoing war than a one-sided campaign. Israel views the UN as biased against it or focusing almost to an obsessive level with the issues of Israel and the conflict with the Palestinians while ignoring many times other issues around the world.
The issue isn't that there are a multitude of resolutions being passed by the United Nations critical of Israel. The issue is Israel's refusal to obey not only UN resolutions, but also the very foundations of international law. Believe me, if Israel would completely end its occupation and allow a Palestinian state to come into formation, you would see an end to these basket of resolutions that are passed every year by the United Nations.
One of the most corrosive issues, which began long before the current war but has sharpened this past year, has involved UNRWA. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees is possibly the most significant UN agency in the Middle East. It was created in 1949 to handle the aftermath of the Nakba, the forced expulsion of Palestinians that accompanied the creation of the State of Israel. Nearly 75 years on, the continued existence of the agency, in the face of all the challenges raised by Israel, serves as a deeply inconvenient reminder of the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. In January, Israel made the explosive allegation that 12 UNRWA workers participated in the Hamas attack on the 7th of October 2023. There was no evidence provided with the allegation, but it sent UNRWA into a tailspin. Workers were fired, an investigation was opened, and several major donor countries suspended their funding. UNRWA facilities, schools, medical centers, and shelters have been directly targeted by the Israeli army. Many UNRWA workers have been injured and killed.
The campaign against UNRWA was the most cynical and most dangerous. It was also interesting when the allegations were made, they came immediately after a very significant International Court of Justice judgment. And again, it was a strategic measure by Israel to release this information so that the narrative and the debate became about UNRWA and not about the legitimate criticisms made by a reputable international body.
The rhetoric that you hear about UNRWA from the Israeli side is very important to sort of listen to and deconstruct here, because these accusations of anti-Semitism is not even just to try and bring the organization into disrepute. Israel wants to disband UNRWA because in many ways UNRWA acts as a witness to Israel's crimes on the ground.
Israel's relationship with the United Nations is at the lowest point it has ever been. 1 year since the 7th of October 2023, the theater of war has expanded from the genocide in Gaza to unprecedented violence in the West Bank to all-out fighting with Lebanon and an escalating situation with Iran. Each new bout of violence has necessitated a response from the UN, ineffectual though they have all been, and each UN intervention has sparked outcry in Israel. The UN's Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, has come in for sharp criticism for her outspokenness on Israel's conduct of the war.
Israel cannot behave as it does as an apartheid state and face no consequences.
Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, was banned from entering Israel at the beginning of this month. According to the foreign minister, Guterres had failed to unequivocally condemn Iran for its missile attacks on Israel.
The Secretary General is trying to be the chief executive of a major international organization in very challenging times and trying to lead it while being objective and fair to all of the parties. As for the UN Special Rapporteur, she has been targeted personally and professionally. Despite the campaign orchestrated against her, she is still pursuing her mandate and giving us facts and reports which are based on very thorough legal analysis and on cogent evidence of a situation on the ground.
What Israel is doing is punishing an entire Palestinian population for what Hamas has done.
Regarding the special rapporteur, she has made statements and tweets that even take me as an Israeli who is very critical of the government. I found them impossible to comprehend, certainly not to defend. And I regret that she has said and written those things. And I don't think it made any kind of a positive impact on the UN's involvement in the conflict.
I think this broken relationship between Israel and the United Nations poses probably the single greatest test for the United Nations in this modern era. Here was a nation that was created in the aftermath of the worst genocide that the world has ever known. And yet we find ourselves now with this very nation accused of genocide against the Palestinians. Can the United Nations compel Israel to bring itself in compliance with the United Nations resolutions and to wind up successfully ending on a just and lasting basis the longest lasting item on the UN agenda? As long as this remains an open wound for the United Nations and a continuing festering sore on its agenda, the United Nations' reputation itself for being a force for good in the world is going to suffer.
And finally, with the killing of Yahya Sinwar, many analysts and commentators have alluded to the beginning of the end of Israel's operations in Gaza. For those listening to the discourse within Israel itself, it's clear that Sinwar's assassination marks the close of just one phase and the start of another. When Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, it was a tragedy and a blow to the nation. But in some quarters, it was seen as an historic opportunity to deal with Gaza once and for all. This strip of Palestinian territory has been the site of decades of Israeli victory and defeat, a geography of defiance and threat. And in the past year, Gaza has increasingly been spoken of as a land to be cleansed and annexed by Israel. Conferences about the settlement of Gaza began in November 2023 and have continued right up until now. Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party is among the organizers of an event next week titled Preparing to Settle Gaza. Israeli real estate developers have been putting out artists' impressions of beachfront residences in the Strip for months now. Already, the complete siege of northern Gaza is in effect. Palestinians there have been forced out under intense bombardment and gunfire. No food or water has entered there since the 1st of October. So, while comment columns and op-ed videos may talk of an end to the war on Gaza, there are serious discussions about a prolonged Israeli military occupation and a likely push to change the demographics of the Strip. We'll be tracking those narratives, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.